We're going to start into the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Sometimes unleavened bread gets swallowed up under the title of the Passover. I hear people quite often, including people from a Jewish background, use the terminology of the Passover or the Passover season to refer to this whole series of 3 feasts that we're talking about. Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits. Real technically speaking, Passover is just that one day. Unleavened bread goes 7 to 8 days, but the Passover obviously has far more ritual associated with it than unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is just essentially a period of time in which there's to be no leaven or unleavened bread in the homes, or to be used in any way. Passover is far more detailed than that. But quite often when people are talking about this whole period of these feasts, from Passover, unleavened bread, into first fruits, they refer to it as Passover. When they say that, they mean really the whole season. So you want to make sure that you understand that when somebody's discussing it. There are times when they almost seem to blend together. They are very interrelated. When we look at the types and shadows of these 3 feasts that are the spring feasts, you're going to find out that they are a series not just of back-to-back holy days, so to speak, but they're also very interrelated even in the picture of what they represent in the plan of salvation. Passover, we realize, represents Christ's sacrifice, his death, dying for the sins of his people, and his blood being a covering for them. There are other elements, as we talked about last time. Unleavened bread is much more simple than Passover in terms of what it communicates. It's talking about the fact that there's no leaven. Now, we're going to have to look at what leaven is and what leaven represents in the Bible. It's far deeper than just saying leaven equals sin. If you add traditions to the truth that are counter-biblical traditions, that's leaven. I didn't say traditions. I said counter-biblical traditions. There's different kinds of traditions. We'll have to talk about that sometime. It's very important, especially in a day like we're living in, where we do have some traditions in our body of people. They're traditions either trace back to something biblical, or there's a biblical concept that they're built on. They may not be something that's stated in the Bible regarding some standard or way we do things, but it's built on a concept that's in the Bible. But then there are some traditions that are counter-biblical. When I say they're counter-biblical, I mean they're not just non-biblical in the sense you can't find that exact statement or way of doing things in the Bible, but they actually go against the grain of what the Bible's trying to communicate. Those are dangerous traditions. We never want to be caught up carrying on a tradition that is actually the opposite of what the Bible teaches. And there are many of those in Christianity. If you are using elements of a dispensation that God has closed, and the methods of that particular dispensation aren't something God's using anymore, if you're still using them, you are adding leaven. The simplest example of that is the comparison between the operation of the people of God under the Old Testament and the New Testament. Those are 2 different dispensations. If we're doing everything that they were doing under the Old Covenant, we will be adding leaven to our Christian faith. There are some things under the Old Covenant that God may have intended to go on no matter what covenant there is. They may be eternal in their intent, but we've got to be careful because we'd be adding leaven to New Covenant faith if we require some of the Old Covenant elements of people that aren't under the Old Covenant. That's just one example. But in terms of these first 3 feasts of the year and the spring feasts of Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits, they do have some overlap between them. And this 7 to 8 day period that starts with Passover and goes on through to the end of unleavened bread, and somewhere in that period is where, in the midst or near the end of that period, is where first fruits falls. We'll talk about that later, but first fruits is based on a calculation of when the Sabbath falls. But unleavened bread is almost like the framework in which these 2 feasts that are the beginning, the foundation, if you want to call it, of this period, and the zenith of it. The foundation is Passover, and the zenith, the high point, the climax of this season is first fruits. And unleavened bread is like the framework all that is built inside of. It's the week-long period that all those things are built around. It essentially begins with Passover. The reason that some people say that it might last 8 days and some people say it lasts 7 is that some people start the beginning of it with the evening of Passover, and some people start unleavened bread with the next day. If it starts with the next day, it's going to go on for 7 days after Passover. If it starts with the night of Passover and you're counting that day, it'd be 8 days, you understand? Feast of Unleavened Bread, or components associated with it, are mentioned in a number of different places in the Bible. I can give you a long list of scriptures. I'm not going to do that here. But some of the key places, of course, the same place that Passover is mentioned, Exodus 12, Exodus 13. Those 2 chapters would be central to studying both the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover. Leviticus 23, 6-8 is another example. Numbers 28, 17-25. Deuteronomy 16, 1-8. Now there's other places in the book of Exodus, the 23rd chapter and the 34th chapter, each have in each of them about a verse that mentions this. But those are the key verses that talk about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I always give you the Hebrew words that are key Hebrew words when we're talking about a subject like this in more of a comprehensive approach. There's two different words that are used for leaven or leavened in the Hebrew Bible. The first one of these is the most uncommon. It's seor, S-E-O-R. Seor is leaven itself. It's what produces something that's leavened. It's only used 5 times in the Old Testament, in Exodus 12:15 and Exodus 12:19, 13, 7th verse, and then in Leviticus 2:11 and Deuteronomy 16:4. The word that's most commonly used for leaven is chametz, which is C-H-A-M-E-T-S. That refers to something that is leavened. Leaven is the substance itself. What it does produces something that is leavened. So there's the difference between the two words. I'm not going to give you all the examples of where it's used in the Bible, but you'll find a lot of them in Exodus 12 and 13, some in Leviticus, Deuteronomy. The root word of chametz is actually spelled and pronounced exactly the same as the word itself. It means something that's sharp in taste, that sourness, that leaven might have. It can even carry the meaning of something that's sharp in terms of attitude, or almost anything that you would think of a sharpness, even a color that has a sharp, kind of a shocking appearance to it. It's used about 8 times, by the way, the root word. 5 of the 8 times is translated something to do with leaven, leavened. 3 times is translated entirely different. It's translated a cruel man in Psalm 71:4. Somebody with a sharp, pungent edge to their personality, I imagine, is what's sour-spirited. In Psalm 73:21, it's the word translated grieved. Now you can see how that could mean something sour too, that something's happened that's caused you to have a sour feeling. One other very unique example of it, unlike any other place it's translated, in Isaiah 63:1, where it's describing Christ, and it says, "Who is this cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Basra?" That word dyed is chametz. So there must be some sharp color to that just sets the nerves on edge. The dyed color of those garments is blood, you realize. The iron smell of that blood or something else is what's trying to be communicated by that. I'm just trying to show you that underneath this idea of leaven is this idea of something that's sour, bitter, sharp. In the New Testament, the Greek word that's used for leaven is zume, Z-U-M-E. It's used about 13 times, and we're going to talk about some of those examples tonight because in the New Testament, leaven is really expanded out into some of its symbolic meanings. You're going to see Paul, for example, use leaven in several different ways to refer to conditions going on in the church that are affecting the whole church, that has added a leavening agent to the church, or whether he's talking about things from the law of Moses that are being brought into the new covenant that are not intended to be brought in the new covenant, that are leavening the new covenant faith. There are different kinds of leaven, but leaven in a biblical sense is a piece of fermented dough that's kept over from a former baking. What amounts to a lump of sourdough that's either dissolved in water when you put it in the kneading trowel before you add the flour. They allow it to dissolve in the water, then they add the flour to the liquid. Or this is where you get this phrase, by the way, in Matthew 13:33, when it said a woman hid some leaven in 3 measures of meal. They hide it in the flour. That means they put the leaven in the flour and knead it into the flour. So it's either put into the water. By the way, you could see some pictures in this, couldn't you? What's water and flour maybe represent symbolically? The Word and the Spirit. Adding things to that, see? It's either put into the water until it dissolves to some measure and then you add the flour, or it's worked right into the flour itself, hid in the flour. The negative connotation that's associated with leaven is based on the fact that it's fermentative in nature. It is a fermenting agent. Leaven is usually associated with something sour. There's another ingredient associated with something sweet that is also usually prohibited from being a part of sacrifices. Anyone know what it is? Honey. Both of them add something to the sacrifice. And in the case of both honey and leaven, they both have a fermentative nature. You realize honey can break down because of its sugar content. So it may be based on the fact that there's fermentation capable in some of these ingredients that they were not supposed to be included. Fermentation, of course, represents a process of corruption. When leaven enters into something, it brings about a process of fermentation that results in the breakdown of the original elements. It changes the original elements. It doesn't just mix with them. It actually changes what it's coming into contact with. I very seldom hear people give examples that are positive of leaven, though there are a couple in the Bible. I'm going to come back to them. But I do want to state before I do that, there's only a couple examples in the Bible that you could possibly use that are positive related to leaven. The vast bulk of statements in the Bible about leaven are very negative. But given that there are a few positive statements, you're going to have to consider what that means. Why would leaven be positive in some cases and negative in others? I want you thinking about that as we go through some of these. So it's a catalyst. You know what a catalyst is? A catalyst is something that when you introduce it, it changes the environment it's introduced into. It changes the ingredients that it's introduced into. It doesn't just blend or mix with them. It actually changes them at some level. During the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the houses of the Israelites were required to be completely free of leaven. They could not eat anything but unleavened bread for that 7-day period. Exodus 12:15-20 says, 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread, even the first day you shall put away leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eateth leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. And in the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and in the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation to you. No manner of work shall be done in them, save that which every man must eat. That only may be done of you. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall you observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, you shall eat unleavened bread. That's on the Passover. 14th day is the Passover. Until the 21st day, the 21st day of the month at even. 7 days shall there be no leaven found in your houses, for whosoever eateth that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he be a stranger or born in the land. You shall eat nothing leavened, in all your habitations shall you eat unleavened bread. Exodus 13:6-7 says, 7 days thou shalt eat unleavened bread, in the 7th day shall be a feast of the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, there shall no leavened bread be seen with thee. So don't go carrying it around like I'm saving this for later. Neither shall there be leaven seen with thee in all thy quarters. And then one other example of this is in Deuteronomy 16:2-3. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto the Lord thy God, of the flock and the herd, in the place which the Lord shall choose to place his name there. Thou shalt eat no leavened bread with it. Now that's talking about the Passover meal. And then it goes on to say, 7 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread therewith, even the bread of affliction. For thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt in haste, that thou mayest remember the day when thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt all the days of thy life. Why do you think he would have called it the bread of affliction?
They spent a lot of years in affliction down there.
They had spent quite a long time, several generations, in a state of affliction. In some sense or another, that affliction had increased as it got closer to the time of the Exodus. It didn't start out as what you'd call affliction. It was actually a blessing to begin with. They were able to come in a time of famine and be cared for and to be given an honored place. But slow but sure, that turned against them, and Egypt became a place of affliction for them. It's called in the Bible several times the iron furnace. Egypt. Almost all the time when you see the phrase the iron furnace, it's talking about Egypt. That's not an iron furnace to heat you up some food. That's an iron furnace of persecution.
Does it not taste good? Is that why it's
unleavened bread? The main thing about unleavened bread that's different from regular bread is it's more like a cracker type of a material than it is the soft, doughy bread that we would think of when you have bread that rises.
Oh.
So it's drier. It's not as chewy in the sense of having a softness to it. You know, when we eat bread, we don't realize how much air is in it. It's expanded out quite a bit. Something has to be added to it to cause it to swell up like that. Brother Brands, do you have some?
Yeah, what was the bitter herbs? Bitter herbs, what were those?
Well, the bitter herbs and the bread both represented the hardships that they had gone through. If you're talking about Israel, if you're talking about historically, they both represented the hardships. If you looked at them symbolically, you could get pretty deep. They had to eat unleavened bread in their minds because there wasn't any time to bake it in the natural way and wait for it to rise. They had to eat their bread in haste. And you notice it says that. God had already told them to make it unleavened, so they didn't eat it in haste because they chose that. They said, well, we know God's going to make us leave in just a few hours, so we need some bread we can make real quick. No, God told them to make it that way. He wanted to drive home some points. In the most historical sense for them, he was driving home the point that there has been a period of bitterness, and now you're going to be leaving this place in haste. And I want you to remember this. I want you to remember that you had to leave in haste. And part of remembering that is you don't even get to allow any leaven to be added to your bread and take the time for that bread to puff up, so to speak, so it's a little more tasty. But there's a much deeper typological element to unleavened bread than just what is represented historically there. In a negative context, leaven does represent something negative that's been added. The Israelites might not have got that point right away. They might have just thought this is just about the fact that we're leaving Egypt in haste. There's a number of examples where somebody offered someone unleavened bread in the Bible at a meal. It's almost always because there was a rush. They knew that person wasn't going to be there long. They knew that they weren't going to have an opportunity to fix them a full meal and take the time to bake bread. So they gave them unleavened bread several times. And it's interesting how many of them, of these few times, are associated with angels who appeared. They had to know this angel's probably not just going to hang around here. He's going to be leaving pretty quick after he gives his message. So if I want to give him something, we've got to get something we can give him quickly. So we don't have time to bake bread. You got to give him something quick.
Brother Bear, I don't know how many folks here have ever seen homemade bread made, but my mom made homemade bread, and it would take all day. And even maybe the night before, sometimes she'd take potatoes and cook potatoes and let it set overnight and drain the water off of the potatoes and use the water as leaven. And she put that in the flour. You let it rise, then you knock it down. You let it rise, and you knock it down. You let it rise again, and then you form it into loaves, and you let it set and rise again. So you got an all-day job.
It's a long process, isn't it?
Yeah.
Making unleavened bread takes nothing like the amount of time it takes to make bread. It's something you can do quick. I think it's important to understand there's a difference between what was going on historically that the Israelites would have understood about this. This is all about haste. But then when God started at Sinai to talk about leaven not being added to sacrifices, I'm sure that started to develop more thinking. Now, this must be more than just the fact that he was trying to tell us something about we're leaving in Egypt in haste, because now he's talking about how he doesn't want leaven added to sacrifices. And it might have developed even more of an understanding of what leaven represents. So leaven is more in terms of the Bible than just the historical picture of what happened in Exodus 12, that they had to rush to get out of there. Everything had to be prepared. That doesn't sound particularly negative about leaven, does it? If that was the only example you had in the Bible, you could just say that all that God was saying is, I don't want you taking any time to cook a full meal. This is a time to be ready to be on the move at a moment's notice. That wouldn't make leaven negative by that context, would it? But it's later when we see more statements made about leaven that we can see how God is using it in a negative way. Now I want to stress, again, I'm going to show you why this is, maybe a little later if I get to it. But leaven is not always a negative thing. There's at least 2 examples where it is not negative in the Bible, and there may be 3 or 4, depending on how you interpret them. Let me come back for a minute to this phrase, bread of affliction. It was just the idea that because of this affliction they were under, they couldn't even take the time to have a regular meal in order to escape this. It was a reminder of the terrible slavery they were under and how rushed they were to escape that through the redemptive process God was going to take them through. That word, by the way, in Hebrew, bread of affliction, is lechem oni. And it can also mean bread of humiliation or humbling, because you can be afflicted and it humbles you. The Israelites and even later Jews in their traditions were extremely particular in making certain there was no leaven found in their homes. If there was anything that had leaven in it, the Israelites themselves would not have it, but they also wouldn't allow their animals to have it. They usually would take some time before the Passover to go through the house and slow but sure work all the leaven out, get it out of the house. Whatever was in there was leaven. And then by the time that they got up to the night before the Passover, there was almost a ceremonial approach they had to get rid of the leaven that some modern Hebrews still do today. They would take a candle and go through the house with a candle, turn all the lights out, go through the house with a candle, and either a feather, isn't that something? A feather and a wooden spoon, and any leaven, it was all very ceremonial. Brush that little pieces of leaven or crumbs from leavened bread, either one. I don't think you'd have leaven laying around the house in its doughy state, but you might have some crumbs of some leavened bread, and that would be the same thing in the sense of it needed to be removed. That's one of the most traditional ways they would go through there. They would go by candlelight with a candle in their hand, or maybe later a lamp in their hand, and they would get down and even sweep it out with a feather and a wooden spoon. it wouldn't just be one feather. Sometimes they'd make a little brush out of goose feathers or chicken feathers or some other feathers, and they'd make like a little brush. Like, you ever seen those brushes that are made out of feathers that are used to dust? It'd be something like that. They would tie it together, and they'd use it so they have a little more of a sweeping area and be able to sweep up any leaven or crumbs or anything they could find. Usually this search started at night, as soon as the 14th began. So in the evening of the 14th day of Nisan. Traditionally, in the biblical period, it ended on the 14th at noon on the next day. You realize the 14th goes from evening to evening. It's very unusual for us to say the night of the 14th and then it ended on the day of the 14th. We think that's going backwards in time, don't we? But the 14th started at nightfall and it ended at the next nightfall. So from evening to evening. So they would start in the evening of the 14th, and what we'd think of as the 15th, the next day, they were still going because their day started in the evening. And usually it had to end by noon. I've seen some traditions where they'd even let them go into the next evening to make sure everything was gotten out. In modern practices, some of the Jews will use vacuum cleaners to make sure every tiny little piece of leaven is out of that house. They'll wipe out the cupboards with wet rags, anything to make sure there is no crumb in that house that might be leavened.
So what did they do with the leaven? I mean, so where did they get it when they want it again?
Well, they're going to have to produce some new leaven. They're going to have to start from scratch.
From outside the house.
Yeah, somewhere outside the house. Now, there's a lot of types and shadows in some of that potentially. But all the leaven's gone when they're done. You're not going to be able to take some of your sourdough that you had before and use it quite often, especially in the ancient world. It was almost generational, you know. You'd use it, take a little more. Use it, take some from that. Use it, take some from that. Now, you realize what this matches, don't you? This is what happened to man when sin entered into man. It just kept getting passed down generationally. The leaven of sin just kept getting passed down generationally, just like somebody that takes that little piece and it gets passed on to the next loaf of bread, and it leavens every bit of bread in the house. Now, I'm talking about that very poetic way. But what they did with that leaven, it was destroyed, Sister Wilma. On the evening of the Passover, they'd make one final ritualistic search that is part of what I was describing with the feathers and other things. It's referred to in post-biblical tradition as Bedekat Hametz. Hametz is leaven. The search for the removal of leaven. They'd turn off all the lights, what I was describing earlier, except for the light of a candle. The head of the household would search every corner of that house for crumbs. Now, there's always a lot of rabbinical traditions that get added into these feasts, and later a rabbinical tradition was if there were any rooms that they never had leaven in, that there'd be no reason for leaven to be in, then they wouldn't have to search those rooms. They only had to search the rooms, according to the rabbinical traditions, they only had to search the rooms where leaven might have been. So don't take any leavened bread into your room and be eating it in the middle of the night. As long as you don't do that, you never have to search that room. Now, of course, it's just a tradition. This would be a tough way to search the house. Turn out the lights, get you a candle, take a wooden spoon and some feathers, and brush up all that leaven. Now, by the way, that might sound kind of extreme, but they had cleaned the leaven out before that. This was just a very ceremonial thing. I doubt this is what God's intent was, but in some of the later traditions, they would intentionally put some leaven or some crumbs around different places to make the point that we're getting the last of them out. They would intentionally leave some here and there, so at the last night, they'd leave it usually in conspicuous places, on a windowsill or somewhere like that, knowing that it's intentionally there. And it was a reminder, I'm sure, to the generations to say, Dad, why are you sweeping that leaven off there? What's the point? So it would allow them to have a teaching lesson, so to speak, with the next generation, for one thing. Almost always, the person that did this cleansing of the leaven from the house was the head of the household, the husband. If the husband was not able to do this for some reason, the wife would be in charge of removing all the leaven from the house on this last ceremonial night. If for some reason that weren't the case, some other family member. But it was normally the responsibility of the husband to remove all the leaven. Now you realize that there's a lot of leaven that has entered into the church. And there's been times when Christ has not directly been removing that leaven. And at that time, when he isn't directly working on it, it's our responsibility, as those who are striving to be part of the bride of Christ, to be looking for leaven. When the husband isn't here removing the leaven, we need to be looking for it. If you were paying attention when I was reading the statement about unleavened bread in Exodus 12, you'd notice a pretty strong statement. During the biblical period especially, eating leavened bread at any time during the Feast of Unleavened Bread would result in somebody being cut off from Israel. That's Exodus 12:15. Whosoever eateth leavened bread from the first day until this day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. There should be no eating of it, Brother Chappell.
Would that be a picture of when the church is restored and that pure, unadulterated truth is going forth? If somebody does not conform and they continue to sin, they'll be cut off, judged eternally?
I would apply that, Brother Chappell, to any era where God is operating at that high of a level. The period when the church has been restored would be a very dangerous time to be trying to introduce leaven, because our conception of the church being restored, part of that is truth being restored. Somebody trying to bring back in some old sourdough tradition that was false doctrine, or some method that was a wrong method, or some old dispensational methodology or mannerism that the restoration of the church has moved past, that'd be dangerous to do that. You could be cut off from the entire church. Now, where I think that would be at its highest level is during the millennial reign. During the millennial reign, the sevenfold light of God is going to be shining on this earth. It'll be an extremely dangerous time to attempt to add any leaven or to be eating any leaven. Now, see, there's two different things there. Adding leaven is when you're bringing something in that other people might be affected by. If you add leaven to something, you leaven it. The other thing is if you eat leaven yourself. Do you realize that when the pure word of God is going forth at that level, if you are still feeding on false doctrine or whatever else leaven may represent in that time, you are drinking poison into your soul. And with that level of truth that is being revealed, I'm going to tell you, anytime God is revealing a great measure of truth, and we have had waves of that even in our day, where God has revealed things in a very powerful way. When that's going on, you have to be very careful. When God is working in a way where He's revealing deeper truths or clearer truths, that's a very dangerous time to tamper with anything that would be leaven. This is why I said initially, leaven's a lot more than just sin. You can bring doctrinal leaven in. You can bring leaven in that has to do with your methods. I'll focus on the truth. That's a simple one. When truth is going forth in a very powerful and clear way, it's dangerous then to try to see what leaven you can add to it. Let me see how I can flesh this out. Isn't that funny, that phrase? Fleshing something out is to expand on it, right? That's what we mean by that phrase. But isn't that funny? It would be that phrase, flesh it out. You'll flesh it out, all right. You'll add a whole bunch of flesh to it that doesn't belong there.
Like the man picked up the sticks. The leaven affected him, but if it would have went unpunished, it would have affected the whole congregation.
That's right, Brother Stevens, and that is an example we're going to see that I might parallel with some of Paul's statements about adding a leavening agent into the church are very similar to the Old Testament example that I immediately think of when you bring that up, and that's Achan's sin. What he brought into the camp added something to Israel that did not belong in Israel, and the whole nation was under God's judgment until that was taken out. Now, by the way, the whole nation wasn't killed because of it, but Achan's whole family had to die. But the whole nation was under God's judgment. We'll come back to that probably. Maybe we'll go briefly through that story. There's several examples of leaven being forbidden once you get up to the time of Sinai and afterwards when God's giving the law and He's getting into more details of the law. Leviticus 2:11 says, "No meat offering which you shall bring unto the Lord shall be made with leaven. For you shall burn no leaven nor honey," there's the leaven and honey together, "in any offering of the Lord made by fire." Now notice, though, the qualification here. It's talking about burning it. That's not something to be burned. Leaven wasn't to be associated with blood sacrifices. Exodus 23:18, "Thou shalt not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread." There's a couple statements in the prophets that talk about this in a much more poetic type of a way and much more symbolic type of statements. Hosea 7:4, talking about the Israelites who God said had become adulterers, and I think he means spiritual adulterers by that statement. Notice what he says in the 4th verse of Hosea 7. "They are all adulterers, as an oven heated by the baker, who ceaseth from raising after he hath kneaded the dough until it be leavened." I'm not going to go into that in depth here in mixed company, but it is talking about someone's passions being heated. And notice what it ends on saying in terms of this spiritual adulteration. Amos uses this kind of language too, in the 4th chapter, 4th and 5th verse. Again, talking about some of the idolatry and things that have been introduced by Israel and how they had polluted his worship and his offerings and his sacrifices with leaven. It says, "Come to Bethel and transgress, at Gilgal multiply transgression, and bring your sacrifices every morning." This is not a righteous instruction. This is a sarcastic type of a statement. "And your tithes after 3 years, and offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving with leaven." and proclaim and publish the free offerings. For this liketh you, O you children of Israel, saith the Lord God. That's an odd way of wording that, but when it says, for this liketh you, it's really saying this is what you like to do. You're doing this your own way. This is not the way I want it. This is what you're doing. You're doing this because this is the way you like it. It's worth noting that salt is almost the opposite of leaven when it comes to the sacrifices, and if you're going to contrast them, notice that salt is a preservative. Leaven causes decay, but salt is used for preservation. And salt, it was associated with many of the sacrifices. In fact, Leviticus 2:13 says that every oblation of thy meat offering shalt thou season with salt. Neither shalt thou suffer the salt of the covenant of thy God to be lacking from thy meat offering. With all thine offerings thou shalt offer salt. So that alone tells you a little bit of the picture of what God's trying to communicate. He's trying to preserve in these offerings, not to create decay. And that gets into, of course, some pretty deep things. Here's another reason that some people believe that leaven wasn't included in the sacrifices, that the sacrifices offered to God would be in their least altered state. In other words, closest to the original way God made them. If you introduce leaven, you're introducing an agent that will cause it to be different than its original state. And the sacrifices were to be in their least altered state, in their most original state. Some believe that might be one of the reasons that leaven was a negative in these statements regarding sacrifices. I already mentioned that leavened bread is often used in cases in the Bible where haste is required. And haste in the sense of there not being much time to prepare food. Haste in the sense of there not being much time to eat the food. Maybe both together. Maybe you don't have much time to prepare it and you don't have much time to eat it. And the urgency of both of those things, which was the case of the Israelites in Exodus 12, creates this spirit of haste when you're making your meal, and thus they use unleavened bread rather than leaven. Why don't you give me some examples? Of course, Exodus 12:11 that we've been reading about in the context of the Passover, they ate unleavened bread in haste because they were getting ready to leave Egypt. But what are some other examples?
David and his men eating the showbread.
David and his men might be an example. The showbread is one that is very controversial because there is a lot of debate about whether showbread is unleavened or leavened bread. Later Jewish tradition says that showbread is unleavened bread because nothing leavened could be in the holy place. But there are some very ancient Jewish traditions that seem to communicate the idea that the showbread was leavened bread. So that's still up for discussion.
The angels that Abraham had as Sarah make unleavened bread for. Matter of fact, all the depiction of angels in the Bible showing them eat is always eating unleavened bread.
Isn't that interesting? Did you hear what Brother Chappell said? There's 2 chapters back to back where this occurs in Genesis. Genesis 18, from about the 3rd to the 6th verse, is the first one you referred to, where Abraham asked Sarah to prepare a meal for the angels that had arrived, the 3 angels. The 2 that go down to Sodom in the 19th chapter, Lot prepares them unleavened bread too. And Brother Chappell made the point that it appears, I want to see if you can prove him right or wrong, but it appears that anytime angels sit down to a meal or at least have something offered to them to eat, whether they eat it or not, they have something offered to them to eat, that it's always something that's unleavened if it's bread. So the 18th chapter, the 3rd through the 6th verse, around the 6th verse, I think is where it says Abraham hastened. Notice that word. Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah and said, make ready quickly. Now this is interesting because this is going to parallel a New Testament statement that Jesus made. 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes upon the hearth. Now, by the way, that would have almost had to be unleavened bread. You wouldn't have had time. As Brother Lee gave you a description of how long it took in his example of his mother making bread. You're not going to have time in the time that Abraham was talking to those angels to make leavened bread. You'd have to make unleavened bread. In the 19th chapter, the first 3 verses, when the angels come down to Sodom, and Lot brought them to his home, says there, I think it's in the 3rd verse, he made them a feast and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. So there's another example that reinforces or that validates Brother Chappell's statement about the angels. There's one more example of an angel being offered unleavened bread. It doesn't appear that he eats it, by the way, but these angels did. There's one other example of an angel being offered unleavened bread that doesn't appear that he eats it. Does anyone know where that's at?
Judges 6.
Judges 6:19. Gideon, when he encountered the angel, it said he made ready a kid and unleavened cakes of an ephah of flour. The flesh he put in a basket, he put the broth in a pot, he brought it out unto him under the oak and presented it, and it goes through this very unusual response. The angel really just burns it all up and disappears.
Judges 16, actually, or 13, where Manoah says, I'll make a kid, and the angel says, I will not eat thy bread.
No, he wouldn't eat it.
Unleavened. He just said, I'm not going to eat your bread.
Read the verse.
13:15, Manoah said unto the angel, I pray thee, let us detain thee until we shall have made ready a kid for thee. And the angel of the Lord said unto Manoah, though thou detain me, I will not eat of thy bread. And if thou wilt offer a burnt offering, thou must offer it unto the Lord.
For Manoah knew not that he was an angel of the Lord. Brother Kosa's in Judges 13:16, if you didn't hear that. That the angel said, I won't eat your bread. Now, again, this is an example of something we could talk about typologically in a separate study, because it's very interesting to see why someone would eat or not eat bread in this kind of a context. There's one other example, though, of somebody offering someone leavened bread, and it is almost the opposite kind of a context than what we were just reading in these three examples where somebody offered the angels bread. In Genesis 18, Genesis 19, Judges 6. There's one other example. Anybody know? I'm going to give you a clue. This is not a good person. This is somebody that's not in right relationship with God being offered unleavened bread by somebody that is definitely not in right relationship with God. 1 Samuel 28:24. Do you realize that when Saul went to the house of the witch of Endor, she offered him unleavened bread? It makes perfect sense she'd offer him unleavened bread. I doubt she was doing it to be righteous. She was doing it because she wanted him out of there as quick as she could get him out. She wasn't planning on making a big meal. It was going to take hours. She wanted Saul out of the house. She was already afraid because of the standards of judgment God had against her practices, and she probably thought Saul was going to kill her, as you see in the story. She wanted Saul out of there as quick as she could, so in her haste, she offered him unleavened bread. There's no deep meaning to that she was doing something righteous. She just wanted to get him out of the house as quick as she could, so she tried to give him some food that was the quickest and easiest to prepare. Let's talk about the symbolism of leaven and leavened bread, unleavened bread. We've been touching on it all through this so far, but obviously leaven, when it's used negatively, is symbolic of decay and eventually death. It's a picture of sin and self-will. Those are the two words I usually think of when I think of leaven. It's sin and self-will. Those two things are married to one another, you realize, because carnal self-will always produces sin. That's what happened in the garden, isn't it? Somebody decided to do things their way, despite God's injunction not to do it that way, His command not to do it that way. Leaven is an example of a spiritually corrupting influence or action that takes us out of relationship with God. You're adding something, but do you realize the more of sin, carnality, self-will that you add to you, the less room there is for God? Yeah. So the more leavened you become, the less room there is for God. What was the leavening agent that was introduced in the race of man? That's why I use these two terms, sin and self-will. It was self-will. It was the desire that I'm going to do things according to the way I want to do them. It doesn't matter if it pleases God. It doesn't matter if it even causes me death. I am going to do things my way. That introduced a leavening agent into the race of man that's been passed down, just like that baker taking back that little piece. And every generation, allegorically speaking, every generation of bread is having that original leaven, some element of that original dough, that sourdough, is being passed down generationally, just like man's sin has been passed down generationally. And it's interesting because in Romans 8:21, in one of the statements regarding the condition that the creation is under and the bondage that the creation is under, notice the language that it uses. The creature itself shall be delivered. This is a statement of hope, by the way. But delivered from what? The bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. You realize what the bondage of corruption is? When the leaven of sin and self-will was introduced into the human race, corruption began working in the members of the body of humanity, of the house of Adam. And leaven is corruption, isn't it? It's something that causes decay. So the bondage of corruption is that we're all enslaved to this condition where we're born with this leavening agent within us. And that leaven has to be worked out of us. We've got to get the leaven out. Now, when we talk about getting the leaven out of our house, you can make multiple applications of that. The leaven might need to be taken out of the church house. You're going to find some examples where that's true. The leaven might need to be taken out of your home, your family house where you live. Maybe there's things in your home that are bringing a certain atmosphere or introducing certain thoughts or feelings that are contrary to God. At the deepest level, though, this is the house, this body, that the leaven has to be taken out of. You know, if you can get all the leaven out of here, there won't be leaven in the church. There won't be leaven in your home. This is always the place where the core of the issue is within yourself. So spiritually speaking, that little lump of sourdough, if you want to call it that God introduced into the race of man has been passed down generationally to every loaf of bread that's been produced. In other words, every individual that was born of Adam. One of the most ancient of all the Jewish traditions is that leaven is symbolic of what the ancient Jews called the evil impulse. What is called in Hebrew the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse. Now that means something slightly different to rabbis in a post-biblical period than it meant to the most ancient Jews. Sometimes some of them say it's part of what God intended man to have, that he always has this pull towards good and a pull towards evil. But from our standpoint, the evil impulse would be more synonymous with the fallen nature. It's interesting that some of the most ancient Jewish traditions say that the leaven is the evil impulse. If leaven is a picture of the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, the fallen nature, leaven is still something that has to be introduced. Leaven has to be added for the bread to be leavened. In a negative sense, there's a lot of different ways you can be spiritually leavened. Sin is one way that you can be spiritually leavened. False doctrine is spiritual leaven. Improper methods of doing things, what we call order, can become leaven. Impure motives. Now, there's a reason I'm listing these exact things, because there are some New Testament scriptures that parallel all the examples I just gave you. Sin, false doctrine. Those are leavening agents. Sin will leaven you until there's nothing left for God to do anything with. You're so puffed up in self and self-will, there's no room for God. False doctrine will leaven you. It will corrupt your soul. A false order, a polluted order. And by order, we're talking about the way you do things. Doctrine is what you believe. Order is what you do, what determines your actions and the way you do things. If you get a polluted order of some kind, some improper methods you're using, that can leaven you. It can leaven the church. And then even impure motives, and you're going to see this hinted at in the New Testament as well. The idea that if your motives aren't right for doing something, you can bring a leavening agent into the equation. Sometimes it represents the carnal traditions of man, whether religious, civil, political. Jesus warned his disciples to avoid the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, didn't he? That's in Matthew 16:6 and 16:12. Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. This is one of those examples that happen sometimes in the Bible that are so helpful because it follows it up by telling you exactly what he meant by that. It goes on to say, then understood they how that he bade them not beware of the leaven of bread. In other words, he wasn't talking about the fact that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were eating leavened bread, and you got to watch out for it. You don't know how those guys are cooking it, baking it. They don't know what they're doing. No. But of the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So when he said beware the leaven, we know because the Bible goes back and defines it for you. He wasn't talking about literal leaven. He was talking about that false doctrine, those traditions, and other things that they had introduced into the Scripture, introduced in the religion of Israel. There's another one that goes alongside that, Mark 8:15, where he refers the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. Was he talking about Herod had some false doctrines he was influencing Israel with? Possibly. But I think it's more likely that the leaven that Herod could add would be political leaven. There were political elements he was adding into the religion of Israel. He was influencing the religion and the practices of Israel by his influence, adding elements into that culture and into even the religion to some extent that did not belong there.
Would the tares in the wheat field be like leaven?
Brother Hanwalt said, would the tares that are mixed in with the wheat be like leaven? Maybe in a very surface level sense, Brother Hanwalt, but the difference with leaven is leaven changes the things that it touches. The tares don't really make the wheat different. The fact that the tares are there might make it harder on the wheat, but they don't change the wheat into something different. But in a very surface level sense, they're very similar in terms of the fact that they are things that are in the church that do not belong. But you have to be very careful when you say that about people. There's people in the church that don't belong because you don't like them, or because they don't see things the way you do, or they don't have your kind of personality or your way of doing things, or whatever the case might be. You have to be very careful to address that as people. But people can be leavened. I don't know if I can think of an example in the Bible where a person is ever leaven, but the things people do can leaven the church. A person can be leavened themselves, and if they're leavened themselves, they can leaven other people. But God can deal with an individual who's become leavened and take the leaven out of them. And the reason I know that is because He's done it for me. And I imagine He's done it for all of you if you're honest enough to admit it. You didn't start out unleavened. None of us did. We all started out with a lot of leaven in us. We still have some. And God's working the leaven out. You know how He does that? Same way it gets worked in. You know how they work the leaven in? Remember that one example? They put it into the flour and the water and knead it in until it gets worked in. You know what God's doing? He's working it back out. And He has to do it through the same kind of process. And this wouldn't work in the natural realm, but it does work in the spiritual realm. He's got His fingers in our clay, and He is working us over until He works all the leaven out. That's His goal, is to get the leaven out of us that's been worked into us, that we have inherited, and some of which we didn't inherit. We just picked up on our own, unfortunately. And God's goal is to make us unleavened, in the sense of the negative example of leaven. So traditions can be leavening. That's what Jesus appears to be referring to with the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It, in part, might have been their interpretation of the Scripture. In part, it was traditions that they had added to the Scripture, practices they might have introduced, and how they apply the Word of God. Leaven can be used to refer to hypocrisy. You know what I mean by hypocrisy? That means you are not what you appear to be. Luke 12, 1-3. Jesus, in this case, mentioning the Pharisees in this passage, just like He mentioned the Pharisees and the Sadducees back in Matthew 16, says, "Beware you of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." In other words, they were adding a lot of things to make themselves look more righteous when they were not righteous. They were inflating themselves in terms of their appearance spiritually, constantly drawing attention to yourself. You know what you're doing? You're puffing yourself up to look good. But the sad commentary is, Jesus said, within them is dead men's bones. These are sepulchres. These are not righteous individuals. But they look righteous. They've puffed up the outer man so much to look so big and so impressive spiritually. But it's just leaven. And that leaven is hypocrisy, meaning it's not the real thing. They've puffed themselves up to look bigger than what they really are. It's kind of like what cats do when they're afraid of something. They puff their fur out, don't they? All that hair stands on end. They puff up. They don't just think that's enough, you know. They will get up on their hind legs, arch their back. They'll do everything to look bigger. You realize what these Pharisees were doing? They were trying to look big spiritually. Let me get as much attention as I can. I want everybody to think I'm a righteous and holy individual. And yet that was just hypocrisy, and it was leaven. They had puffed themselves up. They inflated themselves. It wasn't God that made them bigger. So there'd be one example you could use. Paul referred to leavening agents like this in several different letters to the church at Corinth and to the church at Galatia. In 1 Corinthians 5, 6-8, he said, "Your glorying is not good." Now, he's addressing some immorality that had entered into the church. This is where sin that is allowed to continue in the corporate environment, like we mentioned the sin of Achan, sin that's allowed to continue in the corporate environment can affect other people, and it can affect the sanctity of the corporate environment. Your glorying is not good. Know you not that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? Purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Isn't it interesting? He's tying these two together. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. The general message here is that Paul was dealing with sin going on in the church, but he was also dealing with how the church was handling things in their corporate worship, in their interactions with one another, in their judgments. And he wanted them to have the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And the bottom line of that is that even a little small element of sin, if it's persistent enough, can affect a lot more people than that one individual if it's allowed to continue. The other reference that Paul mentions to leaven is in Galatians 5, 7-9. He said, "You did run well. Who did hinder you, that you should not obey the truth? This persuasion cometh not of him that calleth you. A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. By the way, that's related to the idea that there were individuals in Galatia that were trying to bring in some of the old covenant practices that were not part of the new covenant into the new covenant. Things that were requirements under the old covenant that did not transfer forward into the new covenant. And they were trying to bring them along, and Paul, in part, when he was talking about leaven, was referring to that as leaven, introducing some of those elements of that prior dispensation in that did not belong. And if they were allowed to continue, just like that sin continued, it would affect their teaching, it would affect how they understand things. By the way, part of what Paul was addressing here was physical circumcision, and if they would have allowed that to become a central point, that every individual has to go through that process because that's what it was under the law, they might have missed the deeper point that the true circumcision under the new covenant is spiritual circumcision, Holy Spirit baptism. So you could have leavened the truth about Holy Spirit baptism by focusing on the wrong circumcision. Now it's spiritual circumcision that's the most significant and important. And I mentioned Achan. Achan goes along very well with Paul's statements to the church at Corinth about how a little leaven could leaven the whole lump. You know the story of Achan. In some of the battles that occurred, Achan had taken a Babylonish garment. He took 200 shekels of silver. He took a 50 shekel weight gold wedge. And it's obvious that Achan was afraid someone was going to steal from him, or he knew that this was something that he should not have had to begin with because he hid it under his tent. It wasn't as if he was showing the neighbors and saying, look at this. Isn't this nice? Why would you hide it under your tent? Either you didn't trust the neighbors that they'd steal from you, or you knew what you had was wrong. You knew you shouldn't have taken that. And you know the story. I'm just going to touch on it a little bit because it does relate pretty well to this idea of leaven being introduced into a corporate element that can affect everybody. It's in Joshua 7. The first verse says the children of Israel committed a trespass. Notice who committed the trespass. The children of Israel committed a trespass in the accursed thing. For Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took of the accursed thing, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against the children of Israel. So it was Achan that took it, and I would imagine it may be that nobody else in the whole camp had any idea that he had taken it. They didn't even know it was there. And yet God's judgment fell on Israel because that was in the camp. Isn't that amazing? In the case of Paul, when he was writing to Corinth, a lot of the people knew exactly what the problem was, but they wouldn't address it. This man had taken his father's wife and was living in an immoral relationship, and the church would not address it. They allowed him to have a place of prominence, apparently, or at least some kind of influence in the church. They would not address or judge the condition. And Paul was approaching that from the standpoint of, if you let things like this go on, what do you think is going to happen next? If someone thinks it's okay to do this, and they can still continue on in their position in the church, or they don't have anyone telling them that this is inappropriate or improper, it needs to stop, you know what that'll do. It'll open a door. And once that door gets open, people will think you can do almost anything in this church and still have your place. You see how quickly something can leaven something if it's allowed to continue? Well, that is similar to what Achan did, but you realize that in Achan's case, the church, the congregation of Israel, apparently had no idea Achan had even brought this in. And look how severe God dealt with them when they didn't even know it was in the camp. God was trying to make a strong point. And what happened later in Corinth was an expression of that. But in Corinth, the people knew and were allowing it to go on. You know the story, I think, so I'm just going to cover it briefly. Joshua didn't know. It doesn't look like anyone else in the camp of Israel knew. And after he spied out the city of Ai, he sent only 3,000 men to take that city. And because of the fact that the Lord was not covering them, because of that accursed thing that was in the camp, not only were they put to flight by the men of that city, but 36 of the men of Israel were killed. And this was stunning to Joshua because he felt as if God's favor has been on us up to this point. Every time we go up against the enemy, God comes in it. We don't have to have a lot of people. Why do you think he only sent 3,000? We don't have to have a big number if the Lord's on our side. That told him the Lord wasn't on his side. And Joshua fell down before the ark and started pleading with God, God, what is wrong? That is the best possible approach you can have when things start to go in a negative direction in your life, whatever it might be. The first thing you ought to do is fall down before the Lord and say, is there something wrong that can be corrected so that this doesn't continue going in this direction? Joshua fell down before the Lord. The Lord answered him, and you can read it through the 11th to the 13th verse of that 7th chapter. When he said, Israel's sinned, they've transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them. They've taken of the accursed thing and have stolen and dissembled also, and have put it even among their own stuff. You notice he keeps talking about the plural. They did this. They did this. God was holding all of Israel accountable for the fact that that Israelite had done it. Therefore, the children of Israel could not stand before their enemies, but turned their backs before their enemies because they were accursed. This is a pretty strong thing to have to hear from God. Neither will I be with you anymore. Aren't you glad he didn't stop with that? Except, that's a pretty important word when you're under this kind of judgment, don't you think? Wouldn't you like to hear an except? I'm not going to be with you anymore. Except, now the except lets you know there's an out. There's a way to fix this. Except you destroy the accursed thing from among you. Up, sanctify the people, and say, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow. For thus saith the Lord God of Israel, there is an accursed thing in the midst of thee, O Israel. Thou canst not stand before thine enemies until you take away the accursed thing from among you. And you know the story. They went and slow but sure worked their way down until they found where the accursed thing was in Achan's tent. Achan was found out. He ended up confessing. But that did not take him out from underneath the judgment. Not only was Achan taken out and killed, but his whole family was killed with him. And that lifted the judgment of God. That's in the 24th to the 26th verse. I'll give you a few examples of what I think unleavened bread might represent symbolically again, based on these examples in the Old and the New Testament I just mentioned. One, something that is unleavened bread represents a life from which sin has been removed, a life from which self-will has been relinquished. You've given up your own will, not my will. A life free of hypocrisy. You might say that unleavened bread can represent truth that's been purified from false doctrine and man-made traditions. And in a corporate sense, you might refer to the church in this way. A church that's cleansed itself from spiritual pollution is unleavened bread. Remember how Paul talked about them? He said, look, a little leaven, leaveneth the whole lump. You let this go on. What was the whole lump? The whole church. And that little leaven, that man's sin, and some of the things that were going on in that church, their way of addressing that could have leavened that whole condition. So something that is unleavened can represent somebody that is living a life that's free from sin. The sin has been taken out of their life. Sin's been removed. Self-will has been relinquished. They're free of hypocrisy. Now, by the way, those would almost go hand in hand, because if you aren't driven by self-will and sin, you aren't going to have any hypocrisy in you. So, again, a life free from sin. A life free of self-will, that war going on between you and God. Life free of hypocrisy. Again, all those things are interrelated to one another because they all play off of each other. If we're talking about something more broad scale than just talking about an individual, truth that has had all the false doctrine and false counter-biblical traditions removed is unleavened bread. And if we're talking about something corporate, a church that has cleansed itself from spiritual pollution, immorality, carnal order, and ordinances is an example of unleavened bread. Now, I told you earlier, I do think leaven can, in some very unique cases, represent something positive. Based on what leaven really is, leaven is an external agent that's added to something that changes it catalytically. Meaning, it doesn't just merge with it. It doesn't just mix with it. It transforms it. Now, that's very bad if the external agent being added is a bad agent. But that's not necessarily bad if the external agent being added is a good agent. And I can give you some examples. We mentioned showbread. Showbread is a very, as I said, unsettled discussion. There's people that are convinced one way or the other that showbread was leavened or it was unleavened. But if you go back into the most ancient statements made regarding showbread, it is very unclear whether the showbread was leavened or unleavened. That's not, as I said, though, the best example. I'll give you another one. It's still not the best. But there is an example of when you make an offering in Leviticus 7 in the 13th verse that the bread or the cakes that you offer as part of a peace offering could be leavened or unleavened. That alone tells you that leaven can carry a positive connotation at times. Leviticus 7:13 says, besides the cakes, he shall offer for his offering leavened bread with the sacrifice of thanksgiving of his peace offerings. There's an example of leavened bread being actually offered with the offerings. The best example of all, though, there is a really clear example of leaven being used in a very positive way.
Holy Spirit's leaven, isn't it? It's a form of leaven.
You are moving right towards the example I want. Brother Stephen said the Holy Spirit is a leavening agent. If it is, then we should expect to find something that might be parallel with the Holy Spirit typologically associated with leaven. Is there anything?
2 wave loaves.
Tell everybody what the 2 wave loaves are.
That was offered at Pentecost, the 2 wave loaf offerings.
On the day of Pentecost, the second series of first fruits offerings, the first series were on the day of first fruits, when they offered up the first fruits of the barley harvest. On the day of Pentecost, what we call weeks or Shabbot in Hebrew, they offered up the first fruits of the wheat harvest. When they did that, they made 2 loaves of bread to hold up before the Lord. These were not